The Enlightenment took place in the 1700s in Europe, and we undeniably felt its impact in the colonies or the eventual United States. We're going to look at a few of these philosophers whose ideas would trickle down in the 13 colonies. We have Voltaire, who, as a philosopher and a playwright, loved to satirize nobles, the church, and many people disagreed with him, but he pioneered this idea of freedom of speech, that you should be allowed to say something even if someone doesn't want to hear it. Then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He pioneers this idea of the noble savage, that man is born good and it is society that corrupts him. So in order to get back to that goodness, one needs to go back to nature, but you can't just entirely disengage from society. So a way to improve society, to make governments better, is for the government to cooperate with the citizens. And this was in his book, The Social Contract. So it must be a cooperation, a joint effort between the government and those it is governing. Then we have John Locke, whose two treatises on government detail what he calls natural rights, things that he believes you are born with, that are innate, that are God-given. For him, these natural rights, are life, liberty, and property. And so many of these ideas are going to filter into the colonies in the mid-1700s and will eventually make their way into some of our foundational documents. Another element of the Enlightenment is sort of the religious aspect of deism. Now, the Enlightenment is all about logic and reason, and we saw all throughout Europe, and as well as in the 13 colonies, that many people wanted to have sort of a spiritual connection, but using logic and reason, they did not see miracles happening. They did not see a spiritual God currently at work in the world. But they did look at the world and see how complex it was, how detailed it was. So they said there must have been a creator, and this was the analogy of a clock and a clockmaker. And so deists often believed that a divine being or God created the world, but then set it on its own. It was without interaction or without intervention by this divine being. Now, it's not to say that the colonies weren't religious, but by the mid-1700s, the church was dwindling a little bit, not necessarily in the building of churches or the fact that churches existed, because you'll remember that from the earliest colonies and the earliest settlements, churches were built pretty soon, especially in New England. We have the Congregationalists. Then in the South, it's going to be more Anglican. And again, remember, the Congregationalists went to New England. They wanted to build specific communities and settle. In the southern colonies, like Virginia, settlers weren't first intending to settle. They were more interested in agricultural riches and then eventually created more permanent settlements. And so you're going to have more of a distinct English influence with the Anglican Church. By the 1730s and 40s, there is much less church attendance, even in the North where church and state were so connected. And so what's going to happen is there's going to be a whole group of new teachers who bring in new ideas to try and revitalize believers in the New World. And this is known as the Great Awakening. This happens in the 1730s and 40s. And sort of the first American leader of this movement is called Jonathan Edwards. And he's from New England. He's from Connecticut. And he would deliver sermons that were incredibly logical in their thinking process. So this is still part of the Enlightenment, you would say. He wasn't someone who would yell or raise his voice in his sermons, but was very, very methodical. And he is appealing to people's logic. He really is trying to inspire a more spiritual devotion through the means of logic. And some of the things he said, you contribute nothing to your salvation but the sin that made it necessary. So trying to inspire deeper spiritual relationships. He wants people to make their faith personal, but he wants them to understand it on the basis of logic. He doesn't want to get them fired up on simple, feelings. He wants them to truly understand their faith and personalize it for themselves. As other teachers are starting to want to inspire new people, they start traveling. And so we're going to have people who travel throughout the colonies and eventually start preaching or proselytizing to some of the slave communities in the South. One of those traveling or itinerant pastors is an Englishman by the name of George Whitefield. He comes over from England. He travels throughout all of the colonies, and he is one of the first to preach to slaves. And we will see later on in the year how that introduction of Christian faith into these slave communities will ultimately play into what becomes African American culture, the Negro spiritual, and during slavery, the analogy of the Jordan River, of Moses, and delivery into the Promised Land. George Whitefield, unlike Jonathan Edwards, does use sort of a more emotional appeal. He speaks to crowds of thousands of people and really gets them fired up. He says mere heathen morality and not Jesus Christ is preached in most churches. And that certainly was the case. You could purchase a book of sermons. Many people would go into the church as a career because it provided job security, not because they were interested in spiritual devotion or inspiration. And another of my favorite George Whitefield quotes, "The Christian world is in a deep sleep, and nothing but a loud shout can awaken them out of it." So we have a resurgence of faith, and these people considered themselves Christians. They're not hearing the word for the very first time, but they are redevoting their lives, or they're becoming impassioned about this. One of the impacts that we see of the Great Awakening are the establishment of new institutions. So people who are part of this new wave of inspired believers consider themselves new lights. And those who are kind of staid and stuck in the mud would be the old lights. And this even extends to schools. The believers of the new light community, or within the Great Awakening, looked at some of the early universities like Yale and Harvard. And while they were originally created to instruct pastors, in the Great Enlightenment, it's felt that they have kind of fallen down on the job. So there's going to be a whole new group of schools that are founded with the purpose of instructing pastors in this new way of thinking. So we have schools like Columbia. Their motto is, "In thy light, we shall see thy light," so a clear connection to faith there. Princeton, the book at the top of that shield says Old and New Testament. Their motto, "Under the protection of God she flourishes." Brown University, "In God we hope." And Dartmouth, "The voice of one crying out in the wilderness." So we have all of these universities, which today, these Ivy League schools, have no connection. If anything, they shun Christian beliefs, but they were originally created to educate impassioned Christians who would spread the word of God. Another new thing we see as a result of the Great Awakening is several new denominations, the two largest of which are the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church. And so we'll see a new emphasis on reading the word, personal faith, and devotion. And all of this, especially with the Baptists, we will continue to see through this course how the Baptist denomination, particularly in the South, creates what we end up calling the Bible Belt. In addition to uniting the colonies in questioning existing religion, colonists are going to start to question other authorities. And we will continue to see more and more of this, not just in Leading to the Revolution, but also throughout U.S. history.